My talk today begins with my own journey toward a deeper understanding of communal verbal art. And I thought that because this is my own deep passion, and because we've heard these wonderful presentations of fiction and poetry and essay, that it all seemed to work together. So I'll talk about my personal experience, then we will listen to a student's spoken word poem, and then I'll present you with a riddle, which I hope will conclude with your having a sense of the brilliance of early medieval poetry. So I have high hopes for this talk. I wrote a book about early medieval poetry called Signs That Sing, and in case you haven't seen enough of this book cover yet. But when I was in college, and as an undergraduate, I self-published a journal called Waking Up in Between. And I sold the journal on commission for $1 at a local record store and also at a thrift shop. Just like an academic book, I spent more money on making it than on actually profits. Online zines weren't a thing, so this journal was cobbled together from photocopies and staples. People in my undergrad creative writing classes submitted poems. Then, after a while, after a couple issues, local writers became interested. Then submissions from further away began to trickle in. For the covers, I coaxed various artists into giving me surreal line drawings. The guy who lived in the basement across the street, my boyfriend, you know. For the cover, yeah, so I especially loved a good ekphrastic poem. And so this is my segue to John Keats, because he needs to be in every talk. So here's a good ekphrastic poem. Thou still unravished bride of quietness, thou foster child of silence and slow time. Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. These are a few excerpts from Ode on a Grecian Urd. A typed journal can appeal to the eyes, and I imagine one reads it quietly while sitting in the shade. It's a quiet practice. So the power of sound struck me by surprise. I tried out an open mic night at the local coffee house, which is called the Shea. Feeling others listening is very intense, and you feel when you have a group's attention and when you don't. I felt an obligation to follow through, to begin well and to end even better. Being in the presence of others truly listening means that for a moment, everyone in the room is connected by that poem or that story. The poem, the voiced poem, was not the same as the poem on the page. When Keats wrote about the presence of near eternal beauty and truth in the Grecian urn, he wondered about its story, the little town by the river or seashore, or mountain built with peaceful citadel. He realizes, speaking to the town, he says, "Little town, thy streets forevermore will silent be, and not a soul to tell why thou art desolate." But spoken word poetry was not the distant urn. It was a town bustling with people. It was the mysterious priest, a place where silence and sound can coexist. So while I and my friends were creating amateur experiments with words and sound, the slam poetry movement, which began in Chicago, it was taking off. It was going national at the same time. Some of you may know slam poetry from the YouTube channel Button Poetry. I got image happy. So here's Button Poetry. And some of you may know it from old episodes of Russell Simmons' Deaf Poetry Jams. Unless you've actually been to a slam poetry event, it's not quite the same thing. Before slam became widely broadcasted, it was, and it still is, a face-to-face phenomenon that prizes excellent wordsmithing and excellent presentation and community interaction. The slam part of slam poetry refers to the competition that drives these poetry events. A poetry battle that slam pappy Mark Kelly Smith engineered to drum up excitement. Here's the guy who started it all. As for the competition side of things, one axiom is that the best poem never wins. But more importantly, from my perspective, the performance is part of the meaning of the poem. No poem is ever the same poem twice. So, here with me today, as an example, is an undergraduate student of mine, Trevor G. Did I say that right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. To present you with the one and only version of the poem that he's going to give you. In addition to demonstrating the power of spoken word, his poem will also connect us to medieval literature, specifically the conclusion of The Wedding of Sir Gawain and Dame Ragnall, which depicts a courteous Arthurian knight and a cursed woman on their wedding night. So listen carefully, because Trevor's poem will be gone. It'll be gone the second he finishes it.
All right. So I am but a layman, and when I wrote this, I didn't anticipate reading in front of everybody, so be gentle. What's going on here is Dame Ragnall has transformed from a monstrous figure to the beautiful woman that she is, and she has posed a question to Sir Gawain about, do you want me fair during the day or fair during the night? It could only be one. Mm-hmm. And in it, there's a word she uses. She said she's been cursed by necromancy by her stepmother. Mm-hmm. And I know that in that context it means magic, but I think the word was really a fun thing to play with. So I used that idea. And I think anyway, I'll just read it. Mm-hmm. Alas, my love, I cannot choose. For no matter what I do, you and I still lose. To have you fair on nights and no more would leave my heart weak and sore, and my love would not be true. And if I desire you fair during the day, then my want would only be in vain. In town, I would pace the road on parade, but at home I'd hang my head alone in shame for the selfish choice that I had made. There is no book in the Bible, nor psalm, that could point me toward the choice true. So my lady, I place the pick into the flesh of your palm. You must do what is right for you. I am no god. I am no king or tyrant. So I shall close my throat and seal my lips. Your vessel is your own to control, so take the wheel and steer your ship. And I'll be with you, standing right beside with my eyes big, wide, and bright, until the day we ascend into heaven, our bodies showered in light as we slow dance inside. Good Sir Knight, gracious Gawain, you have no idea the pain that your tender heart has slain. I've been shackled, prisoner to the patriarchy, but your mind and ears are key, delivering freedom simply by listening to me. Your honest love has peeled the scum from your eyes. Now you will see my beauty, no matter if it's the sun or moon rising in the sky. Every day we have decisions, we have a choice. But because of my gender disposition, no one has cared to listen to my voice until you came along. This society is populated by necrophiliacs. These heathens have their own idea of love, but theirs is rough and coarse. They want me sedated, silent, still as a corpse, only to consume me, only to consume. But today, I have risen from my tomb. And from my skin, countless flowers will bloom. Today, my heart, it beats loud because of you. We will live our lives together, and we will live them long. And every day we will sing, we will pollinate the earth with our endless song. We will sing freedom, freedom, freedom for all. Thanks.
Thank you so much. This is what can happen when you ask a class to read medieval literature and they're very talented and creative people, and you say, this needs to be performed. What happened here, if you don't mind jump in if I'm misrepresenting this at all, but what happened here, I think, is that you bring the medieval tale to us. It isn't the same, of course, and yet it is a kind of idealized love updated, right? And you wrote this when you came to me and said, "Can I do this?" You said, "It's an act of double translation." You said, "I want to rephrase a section of the written poem in modern English." So a word for word modern English translation, and then I want to make a translation of that into slam poetry, or into that slam kind of spoken word format. And I think it really works. And it makes it more modern, right? Because if you know the story, it's like, oh, the only way anyone wins is by Sir Gawain giving Dame Ragnall the choice. He says, you choose what you want. But it seems very patriarchal all the same, right? And so this is a lovely updating. I think that this poem is both an act of appreciation and it's an act of interpretation of that medieval work. And by speaking it for us, you made us privy to that conversation. The habitat that people think existed for most Old English and Middle English poetry was the voice, not so much the written word. And that's one reason why I asked students to perform, to bring that literature into the voice, to voice it. Those poems were sung or spoken for audiences, and that audience could have just been one person, but it was thought unusual to actually read silently. Before the mid-14th century, the vast majority of poems had no author's attribution. They were recorded anonymously, as if they were just particularly good or particularly stable versions of well-known tales. And lyrics, they were like public domain art. Studies of living oral traditions have been a point of reference for medieval ones. We have no recordings of medieval poets. We have no ethnographic reports about their practices, although sometimes information can be gleaned from public records and from literary representations of performances by bards or minstrels or troubadours or mene-sangers and so on. The poet or shop in Beowulf recites a tale whose subject matter comments on the action of the main story. And that chimes with what we've found in living oral traditions. Not instead of a direct discursive commentary, bringing up a story in the context of public events. Whether or not poets had the vocal power to recite on horseback is another matter. From living oral traditions, researchers have learned a few things about the practice of poetics. And as a writer silently composing poems for the quiet reader, I was astounded. For example, the Gesar epic of Tibet and Mongolia has singers whose repertoires will boggle the mind. They're called Bobsgru, the long-form poets. And a poet known as Old Man Trappa performed 25 cantos equaling 600,000 lines of poetry. This is nearly 25 times the length of Homer's epics combined. Samtrub, more than 40 cantos, at least 700,000 lines. Sering Wandu claimed to know 120 cantos. At the time of the article that I used to research this, they'd only recorded 7. Human, who happens to be a young female poet, she's probably now more of a middle-aged female poet, at that time knew more than 20 cantos. Cantos are like cantos, they're like chapters, but they're poems, right? So they create and recreate all of their cantos on the spot with no written text at hand. So how do they remember so much? How can they sing and sing and sing? They could be recorded. Some of these recordings, I'd have to double check, but they went on for months, right? How do they do it? They do it with fluency. Oral traditional poetry is a specialized register of language. As a kind of language unto itself, this poetry trades in powerful, recurring verbal patterns like lines, couplets, scenes, tropes, themes, entire story patterns, There are interviews with oral poets about how they make their work, the poets who belong to this tradition, and they think of all of these different pattern units as the same thing. And if you say, well, why did you do it different in this recording? They'll say, no, it's the same. It's always the same. For audiences, the recreation of the same story over and over is not trite. The repeated use of a line of verse is not a cliché, quite the contrary. These word patterns are very meaningful. To relate oral traditional word patterns to the body, I think of them as ritualistic gestures. If you can think of a gesture that is particularly potent, I think of the making of the sign of the cross, which I just did not do. But, that's a potent gesture. They're also potent, sort of inflammatory gestures. But imagine having an entire poetic repertoire of these various, patterns, story patterns and line patterns that you have been practicing since you were 8, 10. You're not even deemed proficient to practice in front of an audience until about 20. I mean, that's a long period of practice. And then I'm thinking of the South Slavic tradition. There, it's believed that you don't really fully come into your own as a poet, an epic poet, until you're in your 40s, right? This is a lot of practice, a lot of deep, skillful practice and memory work. So my research on Old English poetry uses the understanding that poems from that period also reflect a strong oral tradition. The poems that we have written down, the ones that are left, they're full of recurring verbal patterns, lines, couplets, scenes, themes, story patterns, meters. And most of their poems have no known authors. Although scribes knew how to represent Latin poetry on the page, at this point in time, there was a tradition of copying that the Anglo-Saxon scribes were really, they knew how to do it. They would represent poetry on the page the way we see it. They would see a line and start, with the capital. Sentence would start with a capital letter. You'd have a line break. Then you'd have punctuation, kind of things you expect. When it comes to Old English poetry, you would generally just see, if you can go online and check out the first page of Beowulf. It's scriptura continua. It continues across the page, sometimes breaking off even in the middle of a word. There are no line breaks. Punctuation is haphazard at best. There's often not any capitalization. How did people make sense of that? Well, the answer seems to be that they already knew. They knew that music. They knew the music of those lines, and they brought that with them when they were reading. They didn't need the other sort of signs, right? The visual signs in order to read it. And this is something that the scholar Catherine O'Brien O'Keefe has looked into quite deeply. This notion that they knew what the lines should sound like already. So research on living oral traditions has also shown that the line between oral tradition and ritual is quite hazy. So if you think of ritual, religious rituals, public ceremonies, if you do any research on oral traditions and ritual traditions in various cultures, you're going to find that where that line is drawn is very different in different situations. So knowing that rituals communicated in similar ways with these kind of recurrent words and gestures that were heavy with meaning, I began to look at references to the Christian liturgy in Old English with new eyes. What happens when you begin interpreting Old English poetry as a hybrid of written practices, oral traditional ones, and liturgical ones? So I'll try to show you with this poem. This is a riddle, as you can see from one of the few words here that you probably understand. So it's called Riddle 30A because there's one that's very, very similar in the same manuscript called the Exeter Book that it appears on a different folio, and it's called Riddle 30B, and only a few words are different. These are our words, our titles. The title doesn't actually exist in the manuscript. So I'm going to read it in Old English so you can hear some of that meter, and then I'll give you a very literal translation. Ich le buzi, laka midwinde, bewunden midwoldre, wedra je somnad. Fus forthwayes, fura je boeskad, beru blowinde, boerninde glade. Full oft mech ysidas, sindaf after hondum, that mech weras on weef blanke kusath. Thona ich mech on habe, and he on nigath tome, moni mid miltse, thera ich monum shal, ukan upkume, arianessa. What's going on? Well, a lot of people have had a lot to say about what's happening here, but this is my attempt at a very literal translation. Sometimes some of the words have double meanings. Fire busy, I vie with the wind, encircled with glory, united with the wind, ready for the way forth, troubled by fire. A grove blooming, burning, an ember. Very often retainers send me from hand to hand so that proud men and women kiss me. When I raise myself up, and many bow to me with humility, there I ought to increase for all people the upspringing of blessedness. What am I? Say what I am called. That's what a lot of the riddles, they have that kind of phrase in them. Well, anyone want to try? Do you have any ideas?
Burning bush.
A burning bush. Okay, that's very nice. I like that. And maybe you've come across the right answer, the one that hasn't been proposed yet. Yeah.
All right, so it's
well, the preferred solution, since F.A. Blackburn, is tree. Or he used Old English ambam, which has a fuller sense to it. It can mean wooden objects as well, besides just tree. So it could also mean log or ship or harp or cup or cross. It has this poem has so many possibilities embedded in it. Craig Williamson, who also wrote some wonderful translations of these riddles, he says that the riddle's first half, up to ember here, it treats the various aspects and uses of a tree, and the second half focuses on wood fashioned by art. And that structure follows what is typical in a number of Old English poems, where you have first a description of the material, and second, a description of what is made from that material. In the discussion that I'll give you here, I'll emphasize the tree's transformation into a cross or a crucifix. William says that lines 1 to 4 appear to portray a tree in a variety of natural states, attacked by the wind, lit up by lightning, and bewunden midwoldre, flush with glory, means blossoming. There are other clues that describe a range of happy and hateful states that may occur during the tree's natural lifespan. So this fourth line, a grove blooming, burning, and ember, seems to give you the fullness of its lifespan. And there's a half line in particular that stands out because it less easily fits the stationary imagery of the first 4 lines, and that is fus forthwayes. If you read the riddle knowing a little bit about oral traditional phrases in Old English poetry, then you'll notice that this phrase, fus forthwayes, can mean more than just the word-for-word translation, which is eager for the journey, or ready for the way forth, as I have here. That phrase actually resonates with other instances of half-line systems and has many collocations. And so even though there's some grammatical and syntactical and metrical variances, these lines all represent a shared idea, which is a desire to hasten forth, risking and embracing death. That's the part that's not said, but is true of this idiom in many instances. In this context, this idiomatic significance of fus forthveus, it underscores the tree's courage and its potential to represent the Christian cross as it faces spiritual battle on earth and bears souls toward heaven. By the way, these were Christian writers for the most part, so that's going to be much of their focus. In lines 5 to 9, the tree becomes a cross or a crucifix or a cup. And so some people have said, no, this riddle means mead cup. That's how they see it. And since no one wrote down the answers to the riddles, we could go on forever thinking about it. You have the kinds of representations of the kinds of ritual acts that could happen with this wooden object. So you have men passing tree from hand to hand, touching the tree to their lips, bowing before it. Both the mead cup and the cross unite companions in a kind of ceremonial display that entails kissing, because you would, there is a riddle where, and it seems very definitively to be a cup, but the act of kissing occurs in it, because that's what you do when you put a cup to your lips. So veneration of the cross also involves kissing the cross. Raising the object, perhaps you would raise a cup to begin a speech, you would raise an object in worship. Depictions of these acts could have resonated with Anglo-Saxon audiences familiar with Germanic drinking ceremonies, or with the veneration of the cross, or celebrating the Eucharist at Mass. Both a cup and a cross can be a bearer of what I've translated here as blessedness, or the upspringing of blessedness, because akuma can also mean growth, and there's connotations of an interior blossoming, perhaps intoxication, and a spiritual fertility. The image of the mead cup then shades into that of the Eucharist chalice, allowing these lines to resonate with emblems of the crucifixion and the Eucharist simultaneously, which is very much like Anglo-Saxon iconography of crosses. So you have crosses and the beams are wound about by grapevines, and the grapevines are alluding to the wine that will be the blood of Christ. Associations with the crucifixion and the Eucharist could then prompt the reader to return in a very medieval fashion to the first half of the poem in search of what is called a redemptive typology. And this is, I don't mean to lay it on too thick here, but this is where you would go back to a first reading, a first level of understanding, and then look for a level of understanding that would be more spiritual. So if you're reading the first 4 lines as a tree's lifespan, then how do you read a more spiritual level into that? And this practice, the practice of redemptive typology, spurred men who were trained in this mode of thinking to find Christ's life foreshadowed in ancient Hebrew texts that had been adopted by Christians. As Brian Stock notes, this practice expanded to include many other valued narratives. So rereading, rehearing brings to the foreground the manner in which the early images in the poem contain their own potential for spiritual transformation. In the very lines that describe the natural tree, we can also find the spiritual tree. So while in its natural state, the tree carries the potential to become fixed in the likeness of not just any tree, but the holiest of trees, being bewunden mid woldra, encircled with glory. Apocalyptic associations in the first 4 lines underscore this sort of notion. So If you were thinking of the Eucharist and the cross here, you would come back and you would start reading the apocalypse into this poem. There you have this fire imagery of being lay busy or fire busy, Flurie Busgad, troubled with fire, burnende glade, a burning ember. These recall the apocalyptic flames out of which the cross was believed to rise on the day of judgment. So by revisiting lines 1 to 4, in search of the tree's multi-layered potential for transformation, we can describe the fire-busy branches of a burning grove. In that image, we can describe the image of a radiant cross in the night sky. Archaeological evidence attests to the Anglo-Saxons' familiarity with the image of the ravening cross glowing amid the stars. And in the poem Elena, the cross appears radiant in the night sky. This was a common medieval image. Sorry, I lost my spot. All right. So this cross is thought to simultaneously span the 4 corners of the earth, and it quarters the cosmic round. Along the same lines, there's an Anglo-Saxon coin, probably from the reign of Ecgfrith, which bears a cross surrounded by rays of light, and the inscription of a cross and the word lux, or light. So the first half of the riddle flickers, and the second flicker between 2 states. On the one hand, the solver can discover a tree on the way to coming across, and on the other hand, the solver may be reminded of cross icons, those that flower, those that radiate light, and those ringed by flaming stars. So the mystery of sacred indwelling pervades the opening lines of the riddle, whose images present a natural tree and a sacred rood simultaneously. I would say that this is no Grecian urn. This is no cold pastoral, right? Although my reading of the poem began within an oral traditional framework that privileges recurrent sound, it has ended in a kind of reverse ekphrasis, a poem that makes iconic imagery. And what I love about Old English poems are their ability to interweave signs from so many different artistic and intellectual domains. So, thank you so much.